Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for March 18th, 2024. We've reached what I would call a tipping point in the two major wars underway on the planet. And by that I mean, on the one side, you clearly have a drive coming from the Anglo-American Empire to continue the wars and in fact escalate against Russia in Ukraine and against the Palestinians in Gaza. This has been increasingly clear, and I'll review some of the developments of that in a moment. But on the other side, we're seeing for the first time more aggressive statements calling for negotiations and an end to these wars. Now, ultimately, the British are not going to stop. The Anglo-American neocons will continue because they're fighting for their survival. And by their survival, I mean the survival of the unipolar order that came into existence at the end of the Soviet era in 1990-91, when they proclaimed themselves the center of the rules-based order, meaning they would be able to issue the rules of international trade and economics backed by the military power of the US and NATO. That's what the rules-based order is. It's collapsing. There's growing opposition around the world, and increasingly now within the West itself. So let me review some of this in terms of, in particular, what's happening in Europe, but also in the United States. Now, on Ukraine, it's become an increasingly divisive issue. Why? Because it's so evident to so many that Ukraine cannot win, even though the line coming from NATO and NATO governments is that Ukraine must win. They almost are stuck in the 1960s with the domino theory. If Putin crushes Ukraine, next will be Poland, the Baltic states, then Germany, France, and so on. An absurd formulation based on nothing but talking points developed by the Russophobes at Chatham House and the Atlantic Council, the CFR, the Heritage Foundation, and so on. But it's obvious to many that Ukraine can't win. Now, one of the more delusional people is the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, who has now, for the last 2 years, been saying no negotiations after negotiations were nearly successful in March of 2 years ago in ending the war then. But Zelensky says we have to keep fighting until Ukraine wins. Now, Biden said the same thing in his State of the Union address. He basically said, quote, "We will not bow down to Putin," making this somewhat of a macho contest between himself and Putin, which mirrors what Donald Trump has said, that had Trump been president, Putin would never have gone into Ukraine. You have Macron, the French leader, who has been saying things like, we can't rule out NATO boots, long-range missiles, stop placing limits on what we're doing. And one of my African friends said that Macron is obviously nervous after the French got kicked out of Africa, in Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and elsewhere, that he's now threatening to go into Ukraine. But with what army? With what mandate does he have for that? Now, meanwhile, you have Ukrainian drones targeting inside Russia with increasing frequency, even though with very little effect. But the effect that it does have is to convince the Russians that they have to fight harder. Now, in Germany, you have a real split where you have the Free Democrats, who are almost down to zero in the polls under their neoliberal Lindner, who's in the government, saying that the missiles should be provided, that the Germans should provide the long-range missiles to Ukraine. The Greens remain fully committed to the war. But Scholz in the Bundestag said no to deploying Taurus missiles. Now, interestingly, you had a meeting of Scholz with Macron and Tusk of Poland. It's not clear what they discussed and what they decided other than to continue the war. But the Italian Foreign Minister Tajani made a very interesting statement over the weekend. He criticized the possible deployment of NATO troops. He said, putting NATO troops in Ukraine, quote, means risking the Third World War, unquote. on the controversy over the Pope's remarks about the courage to negotiate. And by the way, there's a tremendous controversy with many leaders attacking the Pope as a puppet of Putin and so on. What Tajani said is, what did the Pope say? He said, I want peace. Get around the table and make peace. Now we see a similar potential developing in the United States around Gaza, typified by the speech by Schumer, who called for an election to replace Netanyahu in Israel. Now this led to an immediate reaction from one of the leading morons of the Warhawk faction, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who said, what makes it right for this body, referring to the Senate, to call for a regime change in another country? That's not his exact words, but essentially he said calling for replacing the leader of another country. Well, Graham may be suffering dementia, forgetting that he, from 2015 forward, has been calling for regime change in Moscow. So you see the irony, the bitter irony of the Warhawks contradicting themselves, falling all over themselves to try and remain true to the idea of sustaining a war. Now, we'll see what actually is behind the Schumer statement. I think it may be partly to provide a flank for Biden to move against Netanyahu, or possibly Schumer is just feeling that he has to step forward as a Jewish leader to contain the opposition in the Jewish community, where the Jewish Voices for Peace, mostly young people, are demonstrating all over the country against U.S. support for Netanyahu. And more than 500 rabbis have signed a letter critical of Biden's support for Netanyahu. So Schumer may be flying a proposal that would give Biden a way to move out of this. Now, interestingly, was the Galloway election in the United Kingdom, where Galloway, who ran as basically a new party, and secondly, an independent, came in first and second in the by-election vote in Rochdale, but finishing a distant third and fourth through the Labour Party and Tory Party candidates. Now, Galloway himself made the comment when asked about the idea of the U.S. opening a port to provide aid in Gaza, because part of his campaign was that we must provide immediate, massive aid to the Palestinians in Gaza. He said, why not order Israel to open the gates and let food flow in? Now, I want to read you some quotes from former Ambassador Craig Murray on the importance of the Galloway victory and the reaction of Sunak and others, the Prime Minister, the incredibly shrinking Prime Minister, as Galloway calls him, in reaction to the vote for Galloway. He said, the Prime Minister, this is from Craig Murray on March 12th. By the way, Murray is one of the leading fighters for freedom for Julian Assange. But he said, Sunak denounced Galloway's election as an assault on British values and even on democracy itself. And Murray says, the idea that democracy, that is voting for somebody, is an attack on democracy was so crazy that had we any kind of independent media, it would have been ridiculed to death. Then he goes on to point out, instead, we're seeing the British government mobilizing to silence opposition, typified by Sunak's statement, calling anyone who's for peace in Gaza an extremist. And Murray writes, anyone currently not being branded as an extremist ought to be deeply ashamed. Only active supporters of genocide, in the official view, are not extremists. And he finished his article by saying, referring again to Galloway's victory, our hearts and minds remain with the people of Gaza. Their suffering and their heroism not only shines in itself, but it has cast a much-needed light on the complete failure of the model of Western democracy. This is a point we've been making repeatedly. There is no democracy in the West. The idea that we're fighting for democracy in Ukraine, where political opposition parties are outlawed and opposition media have been shut down, this is a fraud. This is a fight between a unipolar order benefiting the corporate cartels and the financial institutions and the military defense sector, as opposed to a real democracy in which the vote would show increasingly that the governments supporting these wars are losing favor. Now, in the United States, we have the Republicans blocking the funding for Biden's Ukraine aid in the House. Even though a number of Republicans support the war, one of the other things driving Republicans is the desire to end the fighting in Ukraine, but put the money into a coming war with China. You have a split in the Democrats over Israel. And unfortunately, most Republicans are on the side of Biden when it comes to Israel. They think Biden's not doing enough to help Israel destroy Palestine. Well, this is where we are in the world, why I say there's a tipping point. This is why your voice can have an effect today more than ever, because it's clear that these wars go against any form of national security for the nations of the West and are putting us on a course toward wider wars and possibly nuclear exchanges. But the reality is that more and more people are realizing that you can't solve these problems through war. April 13th, we're going to be sponsoring an online conference on the Oasis plan as a way of breaking through for a peace based on what would be in the interests of both Israelis and the broader Arab world. And I'll also be putting a link to the Manhattan Project discussion last Saturday, where I went into more detail on this whole question of what is the basis for this tipping point. Also, you'll see Mike Robinson from the UK column with a very thoughtful look at the censorship regime that's dominating politics in the UK. So take a look at that, and I'll see you again tomorrow.